Hello and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today we're going to be talking about some philosophy of science. Specifically, we're going to be doing that via a discussion of this text right here. It's called On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So in this text, Charles Darwin talks about his theory of evolution, specifically the concept of natural selection. And he wrote this text primarily as a response to another scientist who had published a text with very similar ideas, because this whole idea of evolution was starting to come into fruition, and it was likely going to be the case that if it wasn't Darwin, it was some other scientists that were going to come out with this idea. But Darwin had some specifics of his own original thought that he wanted to put out there and let people know, like, hey, I thought of this, just letting you know. So he wrote this for the layman right here. So it's a science book for the layman. And to that end, he's trying specifically to explain to you what the concept of natural selection is. And by doing that, one of the things that happens is that we understand what natural selection, evolution, what it is not, right? So there's a lot of common misconceptions out there about evolution, and let's clear them up before we get into this text and get into the philosophy of what Charles Darwin is talking about. And we're going to do that by reading some quotes from the introduction written by the editor of this book, of this edition, William Bynum. And I'll start with this quote right here from the introduction. We are not descended from apes. Rather, all primates, apes, as well as human beings, share common ancestors. Apes are our cousins, not our grandparents. And remembering Darwin's insistence on propinquity of descent closely allied to us. But with Darwin's vision of the branching tree of life, present-day species are not the forebears of other existing species. So that's the first thing to clear up. A lot of people say, I don't believe in evolution because we have not descended from apes. I'm not a descendant from an ape. And that's actually not what Charles Darwin is saying at all. Human beings did not descend from, apes from the jungle, primates. Rather, what he's saying is that, all primates, like gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, all those, and human beings, we've all descended via this natural process which we call evolution, from a common ancestor. So that picture, that diagram where you see the gorilla beast, and then you start seeing the progression down with the caveman, Neanderthal, and then finally human beings, that's actually not a correct representation of the theory of evolution, the concept of natural selection. So that's the first thing we have to understand. Like, that's not what evolution is specifically saying. Let me read you another quote from the introduction, which talks about another common misconception. Working independently of Darwin, Herbert Spencer, who lived from 1820 to 1903, used evolution as the basis of a whole series of works in philosophy, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. What became known as social Darwinism, with quotes, social Darwinism, was really social Spencerianism, since it was Spencer who pushed his doctrine of survival of the fittest to its limits in social and national life. Darwin himself was never very political, and once cautioned himself against writing higher and lower when discussing plants and animals. He always insisted that natural selection did not produce a perfect world, merely a world in which those organisms which survived were better adapted than those which had perished. Nature was wasteful and could seem downright cruel, but through natural selection, it had produced the world we inhabit. So that's another thing we need to understand, right? Evolution, this theory, natural selection, doesn't talk about the whole idea of humans progressively becoming better, right? Just better just for the sake of being better. It's only talking about living creatures being more adaptive to their environment. So, you know, you see this whole social connotation with Darwinism, the whole like master race type of situation, which is there's people who are just better than other people due to their ethnic traits. And that's not what Darwin's saying at all. Another thing that is a common misconception, you see this a lot today. You also see the other, what I said before about the master race a lot today, but you also see this thing primarily on the internet where you see a lot of people doing stupid things like, you know, hurting themselves and hitting themselves in the groins and just doing really stupid things, and then they hurt themselves or they injure themselves being stupid, and then, you know, the whole joke is like, yep, that's natural selection. Natural selection, those people are going to go away. And that's also not what natural selection is at all, right? This whole idea that that intelligence makes you more adapted to your environment, that may or may not be true. You know, for example, like being highly intelligent might be a disadvantage to your environment. You know, one example of that is that when you're more intelligent, you're actually more susceptible to mental disabilities, mental disorders like, you know, clinical depression, anxiety, OCD, those types of mental disabilities. An animal that has a lower intellect are not as susceptible to those types of things. So they might be more adapted to environments where you're exposed to a lot more trauma. So really it just depends on your environment and what traits are best to adapt to your environment. This is what natural selection is talking about. This is what the theory of evolution is talking about. So we got to be clear about the theory of evolution before we begin an actual constructive, progressive discussion about evolution and the philosophy behind it. So Darwin begins with a discussion of domesticated animals. And he uses domesticated animals as a sample, as an example, like a very easy to understand example of evolution, natural selection, and process. So let's start that discussion, and we're going to read another quote. This one's going to be from the actual text. And in case you are following along, this is page 40. This is from the second paragraph. A kind of selection, which may be called unconscious, and which results from everyone trying to possess and breed from the best individual animals, is more important. Thus, a man who intends keeping pointers naturally tries to get as good as dogs as he can, and afterwards breeds from his own best dogs. But he has no wish or expectation of permanently altering the breed. Nevertheless, I cannot doubt that this process continued during centuries, which would improve and modify any breed, in the same way as Bakewell, Collins, etc. By this very process, only carried on more methodically, did greatly modify, even during their own lifetimes, the forms and qualities of their cattle. Slow and insensible changes of this kind could never be recognized unless actual measurements or careful drawings of the breeds in question had been made long ago, which might serve for comparison. So human beings have created a lot of breeds. All these breeds of dogs that humans developed over a long period of time. These breeds aren't natural, like a pointer setter or a German shepherd or a bulldog. These kinds of breeds were bred over time, right, to create the specifics that humans wanted, you know, these traits that humans desired. Likewise with all other types of domesticated animals like cows are also bred over time to cater to the specific traits that we wanted as human beings, like producing milk, or, you know, the fat that they create and the muscle that they create, that which we eat. These were traits that human beings desired, that we chose of these animals, and we specifically chose traits from these animals, and, you know, through generations we kept choosing those desirable traits, and we created these breeds. And a lot of this was done consciously, and a lot of this was done unconsciously. And it's interesting because a lot of times we don't think about that. You know, I still talk to people who think that dog breeds, like most dog breeds, were just naturally there. Like a pointer setter has always been there since the dawn of creation, you know, which is interesting. But the thing is, they just never thought of it before. So referring to my notes in the margin, Evolution happens even by human influence without humans not even realizing it. That's something important that we should understand. Evolution is a process that happens without human influence, but it also happens with human influence. And just like the natural selection that we don't realize because it's just so slow, right? We don't realize that without like deeply thinking about it. There's a lot of natural selection that happened that we actually do as human beings that we don't even realize. I mean, that's how ingrained this process is, and how not to say it in a negative way, but naive and ignorant we can be. I'm just being honest about it. This process is happening whether we realize it or not. And not only are we part of that process, we utilize that process for ourselves on other living creatures. And this quote is from page 43. A large amount of change in our cultivated plants, thus slowly and unconsciously accumulated, explains, as I believe, the well-known fact that in a vast number of cases we cannot recognize, and therefore do not know, the wild parent stocks of the plants which have been longest cultivated in our flower and kitchen gardens. This right here is unconscious selection. We're not even conscious of it. Natural forces influenced by humans. Another example is flowers. Right? Most flowers are bred. They're grown from our action. Most flowers you go and buy at the store, the flower store, they haven't naturally been developed just by nature. Florists and botanists, people deeply involved in plant life, they breed these roses, these flowers, these plants. And when you go home and you put them in your house, or you give them to your loved one or whoever, that's natural selection that we have done. Even though often we assume that that flower just grew up but just by nature, by itself alone, just bred originally out of nowhere. They're just by natural processes. Well, sort of, kind of. I mean, we shouldn't. I don't think we should separate ourselves from nature. We are nature. We're part of nature. But the point is that natural selection, evolution, is a process that happens, right? And a lot of people, and there are people out there who, for example, don't buy into it, kind of reject it, even though it's all around us, like from the flowers that we buy at the store or the house plants to the dogs that we love dear, or the cats that we love dear, all the other domesticated animals that we interact with. Either we eat them, or we eat their byproducts, or we ride them like horses. Horses, we go to the rodeo and watch them. That's all evolution, natural selection right there. Now I go to quote number 4, which is on page 46. This is the end of the last paragraph here. No doubt the strawberry had always varied since it was cultivated, but the slight varieties had been neglected. As soon, however, as gardeners picked out individual plants with slightly larger, earlier, or better fruit, and raised seedlings from them, and again picked out the best seedlings and bred them, then there appeared, aided by some crossing with distinct species, those many admirable varieties of the strawberry which have been raised during the last 30 or 40 years. Again, gardeners actually utilizing the process of natural selection to human advantage, picking what we like about strawberries, picking the sweet ones, ignoring the bitter ones, and then breeding these specific kinds of species of strawberry for the human environment, right? That's natural selection, that's evolution. We do it all the time. Now that Charles Darwin sets the stage for domestication of plants and animals, and uses them as examples of evolution to explain his concept of natural selection, he moves on to forces outside human influence. Now let's go to quote number 5, which I picked here, and it is on page 74, and this is the end of the first paragraph here. Battle within battle must ever be recurring with the varying success, and yet in the long run the forces are so nicely balanced that the face of nature remains uniform for long periods of time, though assuredly the merest trifle would often give the victory to one organic being over another. Nevertheless, so profound is our ignorance and so high our presumption that we marvel when we hear of the extinction of an organic being, and as we do not see the cause, we invoke cataclysms to desolate the world or invent laws on the duration of the forms of life. Plants and animals, most remote in the scale of nature, are bound together by a web of complex relations. So he's just talking about how it's difficult for us to fathom the process of evolution because it's so complex and it's so minute yet so grand, so large. And a lot of it has to do with the complexity, the interconnectedness of species with one another and this battle for survival, and how that battle of survival influences the process of how species live and how they develop over generations. This process is incredibly involved, it takes a long period of time, very complex. It has a lot of interconnectivity to it. So it's understandable that we don't apparently see it. Like, it's not obvious to us, that we have to actually sit down, really observe, and we gotta take a scientific approach to realizing this truth. It's not apparent. You're not just going to, see the world and just know it right then and there. It takes time, it takes observation, it takes a scientific process to see, to understand this reality that is evolution. So now I take you to the sixth quote that I picked, and this is on page 284, and this is the beginning of the second paragraph. The theory of natural selection is grounded on the belief that each new variety and ultimately each new species is produced and maintained by having some advantage over those with which it comes into competition, and the consequent extinction of less favored forms almost inevitably follows. It is the same with our domestic productions. When a new and slightly improved variety has been raised, it at first supplants the less improved varieties in the same neighborhood. When much improved, it is transported far and near, like our short-horn cattle, and takes the place of other breeds in other countries. Thus, the appearance of new forms and the disappearance of old forms, both natural and artificial, are bound together. And what Darwin is saying here is that evolution can be seen in the wild as well as domesticated life, what we've been talking about. It can be seen within the influence of humanity and outside the influence of humanity. So what does that mean? Where are we getting at here? Well, I go to quote number 7, page 407. Man does not actually produce variability. He only unintentionally exposes organic beings to new conditions of life. And then nature acts on the organization and causes variability. But man can and does select the variations given to him by nature, and thus accumulate them in any desired manner. He thus adapts animals and plants for his own benefit or pleasure. He may do this methodically, or he may do it unconsciously by preserving the individuals most useful to him at the time, without any thought of altering the breed. It is certain that he can largely influence the character of a breed by selecting. And I read you my little note on the bottom of the page here. Humans have great influence over nature, whether conscious or unconscious. So two things I'm trying to hit home here is that humans have huge influence over the environment. It's true. And back during Darwin's time, and even today, but back in Darwin's time, it was often the idea that humans didn't have that kind of power. Like we were not powerful enough as a species to change our environment or influence species in that way. We couldn't breed new species, essentially. Even though that's exactly what we was doing during that time. Right? People just didn't buy into that. And Charles Darwin is bringing that to light. He's like letting you know, like, look at, this is obvious. Like, we're doing it all the time. Evolution is happening not even at the far reaches of nature. It's happening like right in your own home, when you take your dog home and you pet them, or you buy a plant at the shop, or you eat some, like a butchered animal that you bought from the grocery store or something like that. That's evolution. So he's trying to show you, like, look, Evolution is actually happening, and it's a real thing. Natural selection is a real thing, and one of the easiest ways you can understand this is that we do it, and it's obvious that we're doing it, and here it is. And also, so that's number one, and number two is human beings do have great influence over the process of nature. Now, we don't create nature, like we don't create variability, what Darwin is saying, but we influence variability. We choose which variables we want, and new forms of life are developed based off of our preferences. So we do have that influence. So that's number two. Humans do have great influence over the environment. So let me read you my last quote that I picked, quote number 8. And this is from page 419. It's from the last paragraph. We are always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps. Yes, we definitely are, for sure. That's the thing. Now I go to page 420, the end of the first paragraph. The mind cannot possibly grasp the full meaning of the term of 100 million years. It cannot add up and perceive the full effects of many slight variations, accumulated during an almost infinite number of generations. That is difficult for the human mind to process. We can only develop vague conceptions of that in our head, and we need fields of study like science and even philosophy to understand or try to make sense of what's going on with this, with the truth, the reality of the world. I continue. It is so easy to hide our ignorance under such expressions as the plan of creation, unity of design, etc., and to think that we give an explanation when we only restate a fact. Anyone whose disposition leads him to attach more weight to unexplained difficulties than to the explanation of a certain number of facts will certainly reject my theory. And what he's saying here is, we oftentimes try and simplify things and give explanations that are very simple so that we can understand what's going on. But sometimes the explanations are very difficult. They're very complex, and they're outside our immediate conceptions, right? We have to sit down, we have to think for a long time, we have to process the information, and we have to come up with hard explanations. And if you don't want to do that, you probably will reject his idea of natural selection, because he is talking about things like hundreds of millions of years, large amounts of generations, very tiny slight variations that happen over vast periods of time. If you don't want to sit down and really focus and think about and process those kinds of things, then you're apt to reject the theory of evolution. And this is why people often reject reality, right? They reject truth, because truth is sometimes very complex, very hard, very difficult to understand. I continue with the quote. This is the end of the second paragraph. I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. Whoever is led to believe that species are mutable will do good service by conscientiously expressing his conviction. For only thus can the load be prejudice by which this subject is overwhelmed be removed. And I read you my little note on the side. Only through constructive, progressive debate can prejudice be overcome toward truth. And when we're talking about prejudice, we're talking about prejudice against complexity, against complication, against nature as a very difficult to understand reality. Many people have the compulsion to take the easy explanation, right? They don't want to think about the complex reality of things. They're like, oh no, I can explain this very easily, very specifically. Oh no, that's too difficult. It's got to be simple. Another thing that he says is that good service has to be done conscientiously, expressing his, or I add her, conviction. So you have to speak out. You have to say it loud and proud. If there's some truth that you want to express and you're faced with falsehood, lies, people are explaining reality that's just not true, but it's simple, it's easy to understand, it's easy to digest, right? But We have to be stronger than that. And the people who stand up and talk about what really is true, what really truthfully is reality, right? Whether or not it's complex or not, and oftentimes it is complex, it is very difficult to understand, or it's hard to accept, and using examples that are, obvious, like what Darwin uses for domestication of animals and domestication of plants, by speaking out and letting the truth be told and subjecting yourself to constructive progressive debate and like scientific theory and the scientific method, the scientific process. This is good service. This is good service. So don't be afraid to speak out. If you start understanding reality and truth, and it's not exactly what's obviously presented in front of you, that the truth that you begin to observe makes reality more difficult, more complex. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be prejudiced of that. Face it. Try and understand it. Use tools like science, philosophy, ecology, right? Read, books like Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species, and face that complexity, that difficulty head on. And, because it's all about understanding truth at the end of the day. Because living in a world of falsehood, a reality that's fake, is not going to get you anywhere. And that's some of the philosophy that's on the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. I encourage you to check it out. It is not a complicated book at all. It's written for the average person, the non-scientist. To this day, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings of evolution and concept of natural selection. So I would say that this book right here is highly relevant even in today's world, where natural selection, evolution is commonly accepted now, although there are still many people that reject the idea very passionately, which is sad, but it's true. I encourage you to read it. Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.